Worldwide, it's estimated that 1/3 of plant species are threatened with extinction. In a recent scientific paper published in the Journal of Evolution and Ecology, researchers said that because universities are reducing their basic teaching of plant sciences, people are becoming disconnected with the botanical world, at a time when plants could very well help solve some of our big global environmental problems. Experts say we need to start making some tough decisions about what plant species to conserve and the methods we use to conserve them. Hey, I'm Vanessa Fuchs, and in today's episode of What the Flora, I'm joined by 4 plant specialists, and we're here inside the Calyx at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney. They all share a common goal of saving plants, but their expertise, their approaches, and perhaps even how they define that goal is different. Today we're going to be exploring some tough questions about what plant species to conserve and the best ways to conserve them to see whether there is a best way. While you're watching, leave your questions in the comments section and we'll have one of our experts get back to you. So thank you for everyone for joining me here today inside the Calyx. Now, to help sort of set the scene and give everyone who's watching a better idea of what it is that each of you do, I'll get you all to just briefly introduce yourselves. So we'll start with Dr. Maurizio Rossetto.
Thank you, Vanessa. My name is Maurizio Rossetto, and I head the Research Centre for Ecosystem Resilience here at the Botanic Gardens in Sydney. What we're interested in, as far as research goes, is to try to understand why species are distributed and assembled the way they are. And to do that, we use a range of modern tools from DNA in particular. We focus a lot on genetics, to environmental data, to distributional data, and ecological data. The reason why it's important to combine all those different data sets is that they really enable us to understand not only what are the factors that impact the distribution and assembly of species, but also we can try to explore, particularly using DNA, what were the past processes that have impacted on such distribution assemblages. So in other words, we can follow the dynamics of species through time. Once we can do that, then we're in a much better way to predict how changes in the future might impact on species distributions and on community structure. Having that information then enable us to support and guide restoration practices for common species or common vegetation, but also to support the management of threatened species. And this is currently one of our main interests.
Thanks, Vanessa. It's great to be here. So I'm Michelle Leishman. I'm a professor of biology at Macquarie University. I'm a research and teaching academic, but my specialty is plant ecology. So I have 3 main areas that I work in relation to plant conservation and plant ecology. So the first of these is invasive species. So I'm really interested in what makes a plant species invasive, what's the impact that it has, what can we do about it, how do we manage it. The second area is climate change adaptation. So I'm interested in how can we manage our plant species and our vegetation communities under the climate change that's here and that is going to go rapidly faster and faster and more impactful. And the third one is about urban ecology. So I'm interested in how do we make our urban green infrastructure, our plants in our gardens more resilient for climate change, how do we choose the right species that can cope, and how can we make our cities nature positive. So they're the 3 things that make me excited about plant ecology and conservation.
So I'm Karen Sommerville and I'm based at the Australian Plant Bank and I lead the Rainforest Seed Conservation Project. And the aim of that is to find the best ways to preserve rainforest species ex situ, which is away from the natural environment. So we look at a range of different ways of doing that. It could be seed banking, tissue culture, cryopreservation, or even potted collections or in-ground collections. And we're just looking for the best ways to preserve those species against extinction and also to provide a source of material that we can use to return those plants to their natural habitat and even to use for researching their biology. My skills basically include seed biology and horticulture, but I also have experience in population genetics and pollination biology.
My name's John Siemon. I'm the Director of Horticulture. My team look after 3 incredible botanic gardens that have 3 quite unique ecological environments. The Blue Mountains Botanic Garden at Mount Tomah, our cool climate botanic garden, the Australian Botanic Garden at Mount Annan, our native botanic garden, and our historical 206-year-old botanic garden in the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney. And collectively, those gardens hold an incredibly diverse collection of flora from across the globe, as well as some very unique and special critically endangered plant communities. And my background as a horticultural scientist has me very curious about nature, and I'm very fortunate that I work with lots of like-minded individuals that are passionate about saving plants. And through our living collections, our nursery operations, and partnering up with our science infrastructure, we're able to do some quite phenomenal things with plant conservation. And I think as technology is evolving and we get smarter about our plants and what we know about our plants, we're able to utilise a whole range of tools that hopefully we get to talk about today to save a lot more plants than what we've seen come across our desk so far.
All right, so I know this is going to be really hard to choose, but I'd like to ask each of you what you think is the biggest threat to native plant species in Australia. So we'll start with you, Maurizio.
What a great question, Vanessa. I really think that the greatest threat to biodiversity in general, not only plant biodiversity, but animal biodiversity, is land clearing. Land clearing for human purposes. It might be agriculture, it might be mining, it might be forestry, it might be urban living. But what land clearing does is not only removes individuals and populations, but it also fragments those individual populations. And it also, those fragmented those fragmented populations are smaller and smaller. And as they get smaller, they become less viable, so their overall fitness decreases. Sometimes they are not reproductive anymore, so they cannot produce additional generations. And also they are less adaptable to change. So another common threat that we think about is climate change, and as those populations are getting smaller and smaller, they are less capable to adapt to such critical changes. So I think that that's probably our greatest issue, and it's an issue that has been carried over historically, but unfortunately it's an issue that is still very current to this day.
Well, maybe not surprisingly, I'm going to agree with Maurizio, which is the single biggest threat currently is definitely habitat loss. And like Maurizio said about fragmentation, smaller populations, loss of genetic diversity, and so on. So we've just had the State of the Environment report for Australia released. 7.7 million hectares cleared since between 2000 and 2017. So that's an astonishing amount. We've lost up to 30% of our eucalypt woodlands. Some of our threatened ecological communities, we have less than 5% remaining. So, really, really scary numbers on habitat loss. And this is recognised globally as well, of course, here on our continent. But I'm going to be a bit naughty and say we can't just think about one threat at a time. It's actually not even cumulative different threats. They work synergistically. So we think about habitat loss in conjunction with climate change. What's that doing for our species? Habitat loss in conjunction with invasive species. So it's complicated, but habitat loss at the moment, and then looming above us, climate change.
Yeah, I'd agree wholeheartedly that land clearing is a major issue, and one of the issues with land clearing, apart from the direct impacts, is the secondary impacts. And so those little fragments of vegetation are much more susceptible to weed invasion and to drying out around the edges, so they can be more susceptible to fire. And another impact that is not necessarily related to land clearing, but one that I've had a lot to do with recently, is myrtle rust, which is a disease that arrived in 2010, has rapidly spread along the east coast and now across the northern parts of Australia. And that disease is affecting so many species in the Myrtaceae family and actually changing the structure of communities completely. So yeah, that's one of the big ones that we have to deal with at the moment.
Some really good answers there, and I particularly like Michelle cheating a little bit in amongst that to layer things, because I think we can't take one threat to biodiversity and just say that that's the one thing. Picking up on the last item that Karen mentioned, myrtle rust, for me, I think one of the biggest threats is biosecurity. We've had a lot of news recently in media about diseases that are affecting meat and livestock, foot and mouth disease, but they get a lot of attention, and often plant diseases are long forgotten, even though one disease has the potential to affect lots and lots of different species. So myrtle rust has the ability to decimate thousands of species within the Myrtaceae family, of which it makes up something like 16% of Australia's flora, a staggering number. So for me, it only takes one new biosecurity threat, one disease, to perhaps infect the soils of which our botanic gardens operate in, where we're caring for thousands of plants at one time. It's not like we can wash the floor of a zoo or clean the walls of an art gallery. We actually are at risk of losing lots of species through incursions like that. And I don't think we really, because they're new to Australia, we don't know how they're going to react to our flora. And I think as much as we possibly can, we're very lucky to have such strict quarantine laws in Australia that provide some degree of protection, but ultimately things are getting into our landscape and they're devastating hundreds, if not thousands of species, and they're changing the matrix of the ecology that is really important for keeping those systems healthy and well for the whole planet.
Thanks everyone, some really great answers there, and I know that's tough to choose just one thing, so we are kind of doing some hypotheticals here, and another tricky one, and I just want to ask Michelle and Maurizio this one. What approach do you think gives native plant species in Australia the best chance if you just had to choose one now and into the future? Is it designated protected areas or restoring habitats?
So that's a pretty mean and tricky question, Vanessa, I'd have to say, because I teach conservation biology and I would never teach students that it's one or the other. So you definitely put me on the spot. Look, internationally we're aiming for 30% of seascapes and landscapes to be protected by 2030. That's a 30 by 30 international agreement that we're all working towards. That's the gold standard. But that leaves 70% of our land and seascapes not protected, and we can't just ignore them. So I actually think it's really important that we do integrated conservation so that we have our gold standard, those areas that are in our nature reserves and so on. But then that's supplemented by connecting landscapes, doing restoration, even down to the botanic gardens and our seed banks, which is our last ditch resort that we use for improving genetic diversity and translocation and so on. So again, being naughty, I'm sorry, but it's an impossible question.
Yes, it is a tricky question, Vanessa, and I completely agree with Michelle. You cannot do one without the other. So rather than repeating what Michelle just said, I think we can turn the question a bit, and maybe the focus needs to be more on the fact that we, as humanity, as a community, need to accept the fact that things are changing and that they will continue to change. So maybe we need to accept our vision of stability and trying to go back to what we remember or we think the situation was before, and we need to be prepared that we need to help things along and we need to move things around. And that's very much where this combination between maintaining what remains as natural habitat and trying to recreate or reconnect, as Michelle was saying, those sections is going to be very, very important, but is going to be slightly different from what we used to.
Okay, next up in the hot seat, it's just for John and Karen, this question. Again, it's a tough one, and I just want to hear your thinking behind it. But if there was only one strategy or facility to protect plants, native plants in Australia, do you think a seed bank or a living collection such as a botanic garden would have a greater impact on the overall survival of native plant species in Australia? And we'll start with you, Karen.
Well, I'm very partial to seed banking, Vanessa, but there's no one strategy that fits all plants. In order to be suitable for seed banking, the plant needs to produce the sort of seeds that can be dried and then stored in a freezer, and not all plants will do that. So some of them produce seeds that can't be dried, some of them produce seeds that can't be frozen, some of them produce seeds don't produce seeds at all. And those species need different strategies. And so for those we might need living collections, either in pots or in a botanic garden, or we might need to try getting them into tissue culture and then cryopreserving the shoot tips. So there's a lot of different strategies, and we don't have a single strategy that would fit every plant species. And I really liked Michelle's reference to integrated conservation, because I think that really applies here as well.
I think that's a really good answer, Karen, and I'll probably take a similar tact to you as well and avoid giving one succinct answer. But let me put into context that hospitals look after one species. Zoos often have somewhere between maybe 300 and 500 species. Within our living collection in our 3 botanic gardens in the domain, we're caring for more than 17,500 species of plants. And our Australian plant bank alone has probably in excess of 100 million seeds from more than 20% of Australia's 25,000 plant species. Together, they form one of the great botanic collections of the world. And I know if I ask Maurizio this question, he doesn't get a chance to respond to this, but we need as much genetic diversity before we can even contemplate saying that we've saved a species. And we know that I hate referring to stamp collections, but there's a risk that at some point some of our living collections are just stamp collections unless we've sampled the genetic diversity of the pool that we have at our disposal. And if we're doing our job really well, then hopefully we could argue maybe one day that we have saved species from extinction, and more importantly, be able to put that genetic diversity back, not just as a species, but perhaps the whole ecology. Well, maybe not the whole ecology, but maybe we can contribute in our organisation to the plant ecology and work with other parties and partners and research institutions and conservation agencies to really make sure that conservation ecological systems are well protected, preserved, and maybe one day if we do it really well we won't have a role. But I think for the short term at least, botanic gardens are the linchpin of conservation, and we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure plants are well researched, studied, protected, conserved and stored, regardless of whether it's in a living collection, a potted collection, or maybe in a seed bank.
Well, I know we could keep talking all night. This is really great. This is fantastic discussion. But this does bring me to the final question, which is one for everyone to answer. So it's projected that by the end of the century, as many as 10 billion humans will be competing with other species for space. And some environmentalists argue that for conservation efforts to succeed, we need to accept humans have and will continue to change the landscape. Do you think conservation efforts will be more effective if we make a shift from saving individual plant species to rather focus on more like entire ecosystems? And why don't we start with John this time?
That's probably messed with me the most, that question, Vanessa. I think 206 years of history in our organisation has largely been taking a species by species approach, but we probably aren't keeping up with the rate of risk or potential extinction within the plant species that we care for. And we increasingly know that species don't sit in isolation in ecosystems. So within our team, over many years, we've looked at orchids. They have very specific mycorrhizal associations that are fundamental for their survival on the planet. And so we know that we don't just need to look at the seeds or the plants of orchids, we actually need to look far beyond into their root systems. And there are many other plant species that have that approach, and so we need to adapt our strategies. Here's a challenging question, maybe for the rest of the panel, maybe we can't save everything. I'd hate to be on watch when we lose a species, but maybe there are more important things in the ecosystem that we need to contemplate preserving and make sure all the pollinators are all safe and present. And there's a lot more work that we have to do, not just in our plant world, but we need to start connecting the dots and reaching out to other ecological researchers and scientists to make sure that we're preserving the maximum biological diversity that we possibly can.
I think the interdependence of different species is a really good point to make, and I think in situ conservation of ecosystems is definitely a really great way to go. But we've seen over the last few years how ecosystems can be impacted unexpectedly, like with the fires, the bushfires that we had, with the drought, and with myrtle rust, which has just, been devastating some Myrtaceae-based communities. So I think we need to still preserve the individual species as well, because you never know what's going to happen. We don't know all of the impacts that are going to be coming on the heels of warming temperatures and all the other changes that go with it. So I think we need to have major collaborative approach and just attack it from all possible angles.
I think it's really important that we don't think about our species and our ecosystems isolated from humans. Humans have been living in ecosystems and managing and changing ecosystems for thousands and thousands of years. Aboriginal people have been here 60,000 years, and the continent would look different if they weren't here. Our vegetation would look different. So in the same way that we can't isolate people and management from our species and our ecosystems, we can't isolate species from ecosystems either. So I think, trying to manage individual species, we've lost the boat there. As John mentioned, the rate's speeding up, we can't possibly keep up. Our best approach must always be to manage at the ecosystem level. And if we do that, we can actually manage multiple species at a time. So if we took, for an example, managing our ecosystems with fire management, so how we use fire, how we use them, burn at different time periods, we burn at different time intervals, we get a mosaic of vegetation. By doing that, we'll potentially maximise the number of plant species that we manage to conserve there. So I think we need to integrate species within ecosystems. We need to integrate ecosystems with people management, and that's just the way the world's going. And it's the change in our global change and climate change is so rapid. We need to be looking forward and managing landscapes. We can't possibly conserve and go back to where it was before. So we need to be on that trajectory of change and where we want to be. And humans are an integral part of that. So there you go.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point, and I do agree with what Michelle said. You can't really take the two things apart. I mean, we often think in a human society in costs and value, and we think about ecosystem services and how they serve our needs, but really those ecosystem services are not possible without the sums of the species that make those ecosystems. So both obviously are really important, and also having to think one species at a time becomes very resource and time intensive. So as all the other speakers just said, it's really critical to think about an integrated approach that looks at all of that. But I want to go back to a point a very poignant point that Michelle just made about us humans being part of nature, of course. And how do we work with that? As you mentioned, it's still going to be a while, at least current models suggest it's going to be a while before the human population will level off. So we really, rather than think about how much destruction this constant increase of human population is going to bring to biodiversity and to natural system, we really need to start focusing more into how do we prevent additional damage? How do we live a life? How do we live in a society that is less impactful on nature? And that's probably a better way to try to think about how to deal with constant growth of human population, which is pretty unavoidable.
So it seems that there's not one best way to save plants. It really does take a collective effort. And I hope everyone watching has enjoyed this episode of What the Flora. A huge thank you to everyone here today, John, Karen, Michelle and Maurizio, for joining us and having such a fantastic discussion. So if you've got any questions about anything you've seen in today's episode, or it's sparked some other question for you, then just leave them in the comments section and we'll have one of our experts get back to you. We've got another amazing episode next month, so make sure you hit subscribe and follow the Gardens on our social media accounts. My name's Vanessa Fuchs, and thanks for watching What the Flora.